The Italian countryside is best known for its rare truffles, pasta, and fine wine. But hidden in the mass of olive groves and 15th century castles lies the story of Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence, and a trail of crimes so intricate that despite the involvement of both branches of the Italian law enforcement, as well as international efforts by the FBI, the killer has never been brought to justice and may still very well be at large. Spanning decades, this sick and twisted serial killer prowled the hills of the picturesque countryside looking for young and lustful lovers, using the confines of their own cars with which to consummate their relationships. Outside of the watchful eye of their parents, with whom Italians customarily lived with until their eventual wedding day. Between the years of 1974 and 1985, 14 young adults were murdered and mutilated in what would be the first set of crimes of its kind in the written history of Italy. Florence, Italy, June 7, 1981. The scene at Via dell'Aragio was eerily peaceful. There was a Volkswagen car with what seemed to be a sleeping teenager slumped in the front seat, with his head leaning against the partially broken door window. Upon closer inspection, investigators were able to see the small but noticeable maroon circle on the side of the boy's left temple, which matched up with a bullet-sized hole through the driver's side window. On the other side of the car lay the female victim, supine on the grass with a gold chain in between her lips. She was, like her male counterpart, also shot in the head, and had what seemed to be a bloody mark of an animal scavenging between her legs. As with the male victim, there were no signs of a struggle. The male victim was killed first and was left untouched, save for the quick bullet from the backside into his brain. Both victims were shot with a .22 caliber Beretta long barrel firing Winchester Series H gun, which used copper-jacketed bullets that had a distinct scratch on the shell casing, which, if other shell casings turned up, would identify the gun as the same, as no two scratch marks on the firing pin of a gun are alike. While police would report that there was no evidence that the woman was sexually assaulted or molested while she was alive, later the press would learn the terrible truth about her wounds. The bloody wreckage between the woman's legs was not made by forest animals, but by the deliberate actions of the killer, who, in 3 expert and purposeful circular slices, cut out the woman's vagina and took it with him. To do what with, the medical examiner refused to speculate on tape. Italy boasts the unique statistic of up to 1/3 of its residents having been conceived in a car, as men and women live with their parents until marriage. And because marriages usually happen in Italians' mid-20s, the parked cars of Italy were and still are brimming with young and lustful lovers. First, a peeping Tom, Spalletti, was accused of the murders. The voyeur was part of a larger ring of peeping Toms, who made commodities out of the, quote, good cars, those cars which were filled with young and attractive couples. Despite the fact that there was no evidence to substantiate the police's claims, the public was putting a lot of pressure on the force to hold someone accountable, and this voyeur's well-known exploits in the area made him an easy scapegoat. In his defense, he had used another voyeur as an alibi, but that alibi had a 1-hour hole in it, where his partner in peeping claimed to have seen him walking not but 50 yards from the scene of the double murder. It wasn't until the monster struck again that the police were forced to let Spalletti go, and thus went the first suspect. Many more would come, both far-fetched and far-flung, but more couples first would have to die. Between the June killing and the subsequent October killing, which would soon come, a second murder had been uncovered through the investigative work of the local newspaper La Nazione. This one from 1974, 7 years prior to the one initially investigated in June. This one concerned two more young lovers, Pasquale Gentlecore, a 19-year-old barman, and Stephanie Pinetti, an 18-year-old budding accountant. The couple had ditched their friends for a moment at the local dance club, Club Teen, and instead drove to a clearing by the forest in Borgo San Lorenzo to enjoy the romantic September air and each other. Caught in the act of lovemaking in the boys' Fiat, these high school sweethearts were found riddled with .22 bullet holes and mutilated with stab wounds, with the female victim having 97 knife gashes all over her body and the telltale removal of her pubis area, as well as the post-mortem penetration of a grapevine into the female's vaginal area. As 1981 summer came to a close a year later, a third crime occurred, which also bore the same morbid calling card. On October 23, 1981, Stefano Baldi, 26, and Susanna Cambi, 24, who were engaged to be married in mere months, were found in their car in the middle of Bartolone Fields. Again, the female victim's genitalia had been precisely and methodically removed, with what investigators determined later was a notched knife, possibly a scuba diving knife, as the shapes were consistent. Then an anonymous tip, quote, "Take another look at this crime," referring to a double homicide that had happened in 1968. After receiving this tip, the police went back and were perplexed by the connection of a couple who was killed in the throes of making love. But while the victims were indeed shot with a .22 gun in the car whilst making love, the female victim did not have the vaginal mutilation, which was the killer's morbid calling card. And more confusing, the murderer, the victim's husband, who was said to have caught her in the act of making love to another man, had already confessed to the killing. He swore that the killings had been an act of passion and anger, and after he confessed, the cuckold husband had been behind bars and then in a monitored halfway house his entire life. So now, with the inclusion of the 1968 killing, there were 4 crimes, 4 couples, all dead, all in their cars, and all but the first had had her vagina removed. August, September, June, October. The killer liked the summer nights, or maybe he detested them. But either way, the people of Florence had a reason to fear the balmy summertime months, which brought with them tourists, hillside trysts, and blood. The next killing would happen 7 months later, just as it became summer again, on June 19, 1982. Paolo Minardi, a 22-year-old mechanic, and 20-year-old Antonella Migolorini were unsurprisingly together, as they always were. Nicknamed after a brand of superglue, VINAVIL, they were inseparable. They were killed in the hills of Monte Spitori, but this time the killing seemed to go somehow awry, as the female victim was not mutilated in the same ritualistic manner, and the male victim was left without being properly killed. He would later succumb to his wounds in the hospital without ever regaining consciousness. The victim's car was also hastily crashed and hidden by the killer before he finally got away. All signs that something didn't quite go the killer's way on what would be his 5th double homicide. After this killing, a vehicle that matched a witness description of the light-colored car entering one of the victim's campsites was found on the Tuscan coast. Hidden in the bushes and purposefully camouflaged in leaves, it came back as being registered to Francesco Vinci. He was arrested and charged as the monster in 1982. Perhaps the previous botched slaying was the reason the killer wouldn't emerge again this year, not claiming another set of victims until September of 1983 in Giogoli, in a killing that again would not seem to go the killer's way. However, this killing indicated that Francesco Vinci was not the killer, though he remained incarcerated. The 1983 set of victims could have been mistaken for a heterosexual couple, with one man being a very small build with long blonde hair, but this German couple were very much both males, and that fact seemed to anger the killer upon realization, as after he shot both men, he skipped the rituals he had been so fond of, and instead tore up their gay pornography magazines, and through the pages about their campsite. Police continued to investigate the one hard lead they had. That was the 1968 murder and conviction of Stefano Mele. The police knew he knew something. Stefano Mele would go back and forth on who it was specifically that pulled the trigger that night and killed his wife and her lover in 1968, at times blaming his brother-in-law, Piero Muccirini, and at other times saying it was Giovanni Mele, his brother, that killed Barbara. Mele claimed it was one of the other men at the scene of the crime who provided the Beretta and took the gun away from the scene. Therefore, it was one of them who continued the bloody trail well after the 1968 killings. As a result of his interviews, in January of 1984, police arrested Piero Muccirini, the brother-in-law of Mele, and Giovanni Mele, Stefano's own brother. Police believed the men were definitely accomplices to the 1968 murder and therefore, they suspected, had also had possession of the .22 gun and continued the rampage upon Stefano Mele's taking the blame and subsequent incarceration. Both Piero Muccirini and Giovanni Mele would be charged as the Monster of Florence in what headlines shouted across Italy, "Ci sono due mostri," there are two monsters. The monster, satisfied for the season, lay in wait for warmer airs and moonless nights. The next year's murder would signal a change in the killer's MO, this time adding a twisted detail to the female mutilation, the removal of her left breast. The victims were Claudio Stefanici, a law student, and Pia Gilda Rotini, an 18-year-old cheerleader and bartender. The young lovers were shot and stabbed in Vicchio on July 29, 1984. After this murder, Piero Muccirini and Giovanni Mele, who had previously been in prison since January, were released, as the monster obviously couldn't be them, as they were incarcerated at the time of the Vicchio murders. The final murder that we know of occurred on either September 7th or September 8th, 1985, and took the lives of Jean-Michel Craviccioli and Nadine Moreau, French lovers on holiday. This double murder in 1985 turned out to be the most gruesome killing of them all. The victims had been sleeping in a tent on the side of a forest when the killer made a 12-inch cut in the flaps of the tent. Upon hearing the noise, the lovers opened their tent in confusion, at which time the killer started shooting and killed the female victim almost instantly. But the male victim, an avid sprinter, would manage to run into the woods, at which point the killer caught up with him and slashed his throat, staining the surrounding trees with blood spatter of upwards of 10 feet, leaving his male victim nearly decapitated. The monster went back to the female victim and again removed her vagina and her left breast and took them with him. The murderer, shortly after the killing, excised the female's left nipple and sent it, along with a taunting letter, to one of the prosecutors designated to investigate the monster case. The unlucky recipient was one of the only female prosecutors in Italy at the time, and the only female assigned to the monster case, Silvia Della Monica. She was so disturbed by what she received that she quit law enforcement entirely, most likely to the amusement of the killer. The note dared police to find the dead bodies from which the nipple had been extracted, but by the stumblings of a local mushroom hunter, the bodies were located around the same time the letter arrived to the police station, and the killer's cat-and-mouse game was cut short. This final brutal act would be the last of the monster's known killings, but only the beginning of the investigation. The most likely suspect list comes from what the police refer to as the Sardinian Trail and involves three brothers, Salvatore, Giovanni, and Francesco, who were all ousted from the island of Sardinia to Tuscany. The brothers each were their own brand of terrible. Giovanni was known to have raped his own sister. Francesco Vinci was publicly known for being able to kill, skin, and gut sheep in record time. Cocky and with true Italian swagger, he frequented a bar known for being a front for kidnapping for ransom setups. And although there is no proof that he engaged in these kidnappings, Francesco was reputed for committing petty theft and stealing livestock. But it was perhaps Salvatore Vinci who was most interesting in connection with this case. Quiet and reflective, he had an academic aesthetic about him, with spectacles to complete the look. Salvatore was well known in his hometown of Sardinia for having killed his young wife, Barbarina. She had been married off to Salvatore unwillingly, but was still rumored to be sleeping with her previous boyfriend, Antonio. After Salvatore became medically unwell for a period of months and hospitalized, Barbarina fell pregnant with what most believe was not Salvatore's baby, as he was in the hospital at the time of conception. To add insult to injury, literally, Barbarina named her love child Antonio after his true father, a clear slap in the face of Salvatore, who was bound to raise him as his own. After the birth, Barbarina experienced Salvatore's merciless wrath and was known by neighbors to be mistreated by her older husband, who would routinely lock her and her new baby Antonio in the house with only enough money for a bit of milk for the baby and no food for her, while he went to a bar to schmooze with the ladies. It was on a night like this and so many others that Barbarina had been left to take care of the baby, with not even enough propane in the tank to heat up Antonio's bottle. That detail would become important later, as propane gas would be blamed for her death. She went to a nearby neighbor to use his stove for the heating of her son's bottle, and that was the last time she was ever seen alive. She was found dead 3 hours later, with a propane tank next to her bed, nozzle opened, bruising on her neck, and scratches on her face. How she died of accidental propane exposure when she had to go to another neighbor's house simply to scald the milk is a clear impossibility. Salvatore would later claim he saw his wife with another man, ran off instead of confronting him, and came back with his father and brother, who conveniently were witnesses to Salvatore's horrific discovery of the apparent suicide. The police ruled it a suicide by propane tank, despite the neighbor's very clear story of the wife needing to use the stove to scald the bottle because she in fact had no propane herself. In another red flag that went overlooked by police, Antonio, the 1-year-old baby, who always slept in the bedroom with his mother, had been purposefully moved into the outer room, therefore escaping the supposed deadly gas and explaining why only the wife, and not the child, was now deceased. Later, Rosina, Salvatore's second wife, would unveil the scandalous and strange sexual proclivities of Salvatore Vinci. She recalled that it began with him inviting a married couple to stay the night. Rosina thought nothing of it initially, but later that evening, after awaking to a hand brushing her side, she caught Salvatore quietly attempting to make love with the husband of the other couple. Instead of being ashamed upon his wife's discovery of his homosexual inclinations, Salvatore became violent and forced her to participate in the escapades. She became the unwilling addition to his twisted sexual fantasies, which sometimes involved men and sometimes involved women, but usually, she recalls, involved both. Rosina most regretfully recalled her fears for little Antonio Vinci, the already half-orphaned and ignored boy living, if you could call it that, in the house of this sexual deviant he was forced to call Dad. She was concerned that he was far too aware for all of this to be happening right under his nose, in their small and thin-walled house, and she later would be proven right. Antonio had become incredibly attached to Rosina, as his own mother had been killed in the propane tank-staged suicide, and when she fled the abusive relationship, she had absolutely no legal right or guardianship to the young boy Antonio, who tearfully stayed with his father as he again said goodbye to the only mother figure he had ever known. After Rosina ran away, Salvatore spent no time mourning her absence, and picked up right where he left off, even more exuberantly. Quote, "He liked to make love to me while a man did it to him from behind," recalls a former female lover. "From men to women and zucchinis to eggplants, he seemed to have an insatiable sexual appetite, which could overflow into violence, and led him to making the acquaintance of none other than Stefano Mele, who would play a key role in this complicated and drawn-out investigation." Stefano Mele, who would later confess to and be convicted of the 1968 slaying of his wife and her lover, was described as simple and part of an old and established family. He fell in love with a poor girl named Barbara Loci, a woman who was vivacious, daring, and almost 20 years his junior, and soon they were married. Quickly, though, the bitter and abused Barbara started stealing from the established family and being boldly promiscuous, even going so far as to sneak men back to the family home. Although the older generations of Mele's saw this as her causing the family much shame, the desire to be with men outside her marriage was actually at the bequest of her much older husband, Stefano, who seemed to gain pleasure at the thought of his wife being shared by another man, similarly to Salvatore Vinci. One of the sought-after men brought into the open relationship was the recently immigrated Salvatore Vinci, the Sardinian who was rumored, though this would-be swinging partner didn't know it, to have killed his own wife, similarly named Barberino. Salvatore would be invited to share the couple's home with the stipulation that he also share the bed of Stefano Mele's wife and take her out on dates. He wined and dined her, and it was rumored that Salvatore was the actual father of Barbara's eventual son, Natalino. But Salvatore wasn't the only Vinci brother with whom Barbara would have sexual relations. She would later move on to the youngest of the brothers, the macho gangster Francesco, having passionate fights and public makeups all over the Tuscany town. Eventually, the brothers bored her, and she moved on to another man, who would end up being her last. Antonio Lo Bianco was the man with which she had gone too far, for now she had stolen not only the hearts of the two Vinci brothers Salvatore and Francesco, but also stolen the heart of her husband Stefano Mele and his family money, and caused much shame to the family name. On a warm summer's night in August of 1968, Barbara and Antonio were engaging in lovemaking after attending a movie whilst Barbara and Mele's son, Natalino, was sleeping in the back of the car. Ambushed, the lovers were shot just over the head of the 6-year-old boy, who awoke to the flashes of the muzzle and cowered in horror as his mother was shot 4 times and her lover shot 3. Natalino was removed from the car as his own father wasn't going to let him sit in a car with his dead mother and her lover bleeding out until he was found, and his father dropped him off at a neighbor's house, where he placed him on the doorstep to ring the bell and then ran off, leaving the boy to cry on the steps and tell the neighbor, "Open the door and let me in. I'm sleepy and my daddy is sick in bed. Then you have to drive me home because mommy and my uncle are dead in their car." Natalino, in an obvious result of witness tampering by his own father and uncles, which is what he called the men his mother was openly sleeping with, as he was never able to conclusively say, to this day, just exactly who of the clan of the men was guilty of the murder. Later, after confessing, some believe falsely, Stefano Mele, who didn't have or drive a car, would continue to change his story in regards to who provided the gun and who drove him from the scene. Mele admitted to planning and enacting the murder, but then later, upon being pressed, said it was in fact Salvatore Vinci, who was enraged after Barbara left him for his brother Francesco Vinci. When pressed for a motive, Mele insisted that Salvatore had ominously replied, after finding out about Barbara's affair with his own brother and being asked to repay some money he had borrowed from Mele, "I'll kill your wife for you. That will even up the debt." But later, Mele reverted back to his original confession that he was the sole murderer. Upon harsher interrogation, Mele went back to insisting that it was indeed Salvatore Vinci who had planned and executed the murders, as he was, quote, "the only one with a car," and that he was the one with the .22 Beretta. But when investigators brought Salvatore in for questioning, the two suspects met face to face, and Salvatore Vinci gave Stefano Mele a stare so meaningful that Mele was caused to burst into tears and retract everything he had previously said, again claiming full responsibility for the double homicide. Later, it would be discovered that the meaningful look Salvatore had given Mele was an unspoken threat. He knew Mele was a closet homosexual and encouraged Barbara to seek out men for the sharing. Stefano lusted and pursued male lovers for Barbara so that he could partake in the lovemaking sessions under the guise of being part of a larger ring of swingers, people who have intramarital relationships with the permission or encouragement of their spouses. It would be brought to light that Mele had an extreme fear of Francesco and Salvatore outing him. He was terrified his scandalous secret homosexuality would come out as he traded his freedom for Salvatore's silence. Being unveiled as gay at the time was enough of a fear for Stefano to take the fall for the murder, of which he certainly had not acted alone, and serve his sentence, and later lifetime probation, in a dingy halfway house silently and without further protests of innocence, while the actual monster was free to roam the countryside. Mele later died of natural causes without ever revealing any helpful information as to the true identity of the monster. After the third murder set the Peeping Tom free, both Salvatore Vinci and his brother Francesco Vinci would be taken in and questioned for being the monster, but each time a new brother was brought in, a subsequent murder cleared him as being the lone killer, which some people interpreted as evidence of a larger group of clandestine murderers, and not just a lone wolf, as police originally thought. While Francesco Vinci would spend many months in jail, and Salvatore Vinci would actually be tried as the monster, both were eventually released, and Salvatore acquitted due to lack of evidence. Salvatore later disappeared, while his brother Francesco was found dead, tied up and locked in a car trunk, presumably by the mob. The next suspect? Pietro Pacciani. After unsuccessfully investigating through the usual methods, the Italian police decided to use the beauty of data to solve the mystery. After analyzing the data and records of over 100,000 men in Italy, the Polizia focused in on one man in particular. Pietro Pacciani was a brutish man. Short, lacking in both emotional and intellectual intelligence, he was reputed among the village for his abuse of his wife and daughters, of whom he routinely raped. His incestual sexual deviance aside, what made him stand out among the thousands of male suspects canvassed by the police was two curious coincidences. Firstly, the monster had stopped killing, that the police knew of, between 1974 and 1981, which is also when Pacciani had been in jail for the sexual battery of his children. Secondly, in 1951, Pacciani caught a traveling salesman who was about to become intimate with his soon-to-be wife, and proceeded to beat him to death in front of her, and subsequently rape his fiancée directly next to the dead body. These two facts combined would stand out more garishly upon uncovering a statement that came from Pacciani himself in regards to the 1951 killing. He claimed that he had become enraged and jumped to action when he spied his bride-to-be flash her left breast at the traveling salesman. The left breast of the female victims had been taken in all but the 1968 and 1971 murders. Pacciani was arrested in 1993, and a 12-day search of his home would yield two things. One, a reproduction of Botticelli's Primavera that showed, in part, a nymph vomiting flowers, to which the police would interpret as being apositionally similar to the placing of the gold necklace in the mouth of the 1971 female victim. Police also supposedly uncovered a .22 bullet, which may have been planted by police as it was found by an upper-level investigator who was seemingly needlessly going over a portion of the land which had already been searched for the past 10 days. A policeman who worked on the scene would later speculate off the record that he believed his chief inspector planted the bullet at the scene. Also found at his home was a small, insignificant scrap of cloth, which was dutifully catalogued into evidence, but would later conveniently place a portion of a .22 Beretta gun found wrapped in the same cloth of which they supposedly found a piece earlier at the house of Pacciani. The part of the gun found in the cloth was only a portion of the .22 gun, and therefore conveniently unidentifiable, as was the bullet, and led to no conclusive connection of the monster killings. As an expert later testified, the bullet could conceivably have been inside the monster's gun and then ejected prior to firing, but later that same expert would admit to exceptional pressure from the prosecution to say that the bullet was one the monster could have potentially used, although it had none of the trace marks. But as this expert didn't admit to falsifying the documents until after Pacciani was convicted of all the monster crimes, with the exception of the 1968 killing which was still attributed to Stefano Mele, none of this was uncovered until after the conviction. Despite the fact that there was nothing but circumstantial evidence against Pacciani, the painting of the nymph, the unused bullet, the untraceable gun parts, and the coincidental jail sentence that kept Pacciani off the streets at the same interval that no new killings took place, the public was eager to leave the monster case behind them and get back to the hillside antics for which the country was wont to do, and Pacciani was mostly convicted in the court of public opinion as well as by the courts themselves. Most famously, Pacciani cried out at his trial, "I am a sweet little lamb. I am out here like Christ on the cross." And for that, he gained a small following of, unsurprisingly, young women who, as with many modern prisoners, such as Charles Manson and Scott Peterson, who boast a moderate female following, became enamored with the convicted rapist. Pacciani was convicted of being the Monster of Florence in 1994. In 1996, after a lengthy appeal, which, luckily for the truth, involved none of the players of the original investigation, and led the appeals prosecutor to, instead of arguing to uphold the conviction, fervently disavow the prior investigation as a, quote, Pink Panther-like and darkly comedic twisted affair. Pacciani was acquitted of all charges and was about to walk a free man when a chief inspector paraded into the courtroom saying he had 4 eyewitnesses that actually saw Pacciani committing the crimes. Even the prosecutor dismissed these charges as being a desperate attempt at salvaging the investigation team's, quote, hard work, and was let free with the expectation that the case would be retried utilizing the 4 new supposed witnesses. Pacciani later died of a heart attack before he could ever be retried, and thus died technically a free man, cleared of the monster charges, but still a convicted rapist of his poor daughters and abuser of his forsaken wife. The cast of purported witnesses contained 3 mentally handicapped, illiterate charges of the village who supported those who couldn't support themselves intellectually or financially, and 1 local prostitute. 2 of the 4 implicated not only Pacciani in the double murders, but also themselves. But most locals say they were blackmailed, bribed, or otherwise manipulated into giving false testimony due to their low IQ. 2 of the mentally impaired men were actually convicted of accomplice to murder, as they, falsely, confessed to being present at the scenes of one of the murders at the bequest of a mysterious doctor who paid them to harvest the female organs. Later, 2 public officials, Guttieri and Mingini, would be tried and censured for abuse of office among many allegations of mishandling police information, obstructing justice, and falsification of evidence as well as witness tampering in these cases. While the investigators were censured for their handling of this portion of the case, it led to another twisted theory which became popular among conspiracy theorists, and that is the theory that the murderers were actually the assassins of a larger, more wealthy female group of high society individuals who needed the female vulva to be harvested for their ritualistic sex parties. The Hollywood-esque images of eyes wide shut masked sex balls and group copulations was too much for the press, which ran with the secret sex society angle, theorizing that the doctor that one of the mentally slow witnesses mentioned was evidence that the people in this circle were of a high social standing. One such suppression of valuable information that could have helped the case was the fact that the well-known FBI behavioral science unit at Quantico secretly was asked to draw up a profile on the Monster of Florence, but that profile was not shared with all the investigating parties, withholding valuable information. The behavioral analysts at the FBI produced a document which portrayed the killer as an upper-middle-class loner who had little contact or success with women. This person, presumably male, would have had his own car and probably kept his fetishes at a second location, away from his personal life. The perpetrator of these so-called lust murders would most likely stake out both the locations of the killing and his victims beforehand, as he would want to ensure complete preparedness. FBI psychologists theorized that the predator most likely watched the victims from afar, as to wait until the moment of copulation to make his move. The report quotes the function of the male as being nothing but an impediment to the killer's main focus, the female, and it is for that reason that the killer utilized a, quote, BLITZ method of attack, where he would shoot numerous times at a close enough range to incapacitate the man, and then would drag the woman some distance off so he could get on with his normal genital mutilation. The FBI asserted that the lack of penetration of the female, along with the sexually violent method of mutilation, displayed that the killer was most likely sexually impotent or incompetent, and used his methods as a way of ritual sexual activity without the customary penetration of the female with the male member. The FBI further hypothesized that the ritualized use of a specific .22 Beretta and a notched knife, possibly a scuba knife, was part of the killer's, quote, kit, a specific set of instruments of terror. These tools, albeit being highly sought after and specific, were so important to the killer that he must have done a risk-reward analysis and decided that he felt comfortable enough to use them to repeat his pattern of ceremonial maiming. The fact that many of the victims were all of Caucasian descent suggested to the FBI that the killer was also white, and that his knowledge of the Italian countryside indicated he was a local Italian who most likely had family living in the areas in which the victims were killed. The behavioral analysts at the FBI also theorized that this male was probably in a job where he had little contact with the outside world, as he would feel too inadequate to do so. They also postulated that he may have served in the military due to his propensity to stake out and stalk the victims. This could also explain his periods of inactivity, as he may have been on military service elsewhere. The behaviorists at Quantico also speculated that the man was one of control and discipline, but that he may have used some intoxicants, possibly drugs or alcohol, to dull his nerves before an event of killing, and being around people may make him anxious due to his inferiority complex, and that, therefore, after the murders he may appear depleted or exhausted, and recuse himself to his private domicile or place of hiding, and catalog his souvenirs, which could be clothing, jewelry, or portions of the female's body. This profile significantly differed from the always drunk, poor, uneducated PACCIANI, who was far too inebriated to even write his own name, much less engage in these meticulous stakeouts and rituals, which is why this FBI profile was never released to the public or used in any of the trials. It simply didn't match the rest of the prosecutor's story or timeline, so it was suppressed. The last theory. The killings have many blurry edges and foggy connections, but one fact remains true. The first double murder holds the key. The first murder, the 1968 slaying of Barbara Melee and her lover in the car while her son watched, was the first instance of the distinctive .22 Beretta long rifle gun being used to kill. That murder is conclusively linked to the Vinci clan, as Stefano Melee, The man convicted for the murders have put the clan at the location of the murders, and often he went between one of the Vinci brothers as being the actual trigger man. In the spring of 1974, just 4 months prior to the first killing since the 1968 murder, and the first killing to involve the genital mutilation, Salvatore Vinci would go to police and file a report of breaking and entering against his estranged son, 15-year-old Antonio Vinci, the 1-year-old toddler who was found outside of his dead mother's bedroom 14 years prior, of which Salvatore was later tried for faking. Although the police report Salvatore filed indicated nothing from the house had been stolen, it seems evident that the .22 gun from the 1968 killings, committed by the Vinci brothers when Antonio was just a kid, would have been stashed in Salvatore's house. And in filing that police report, Salvatore could have been establishing a paper trail for the crime and transfer of the murder weapon, once used and to be used again. 4 months later, in the summer of 1974, the first of the new reign of terror would take place, using the same gun and adding the twisted detail of the genitalia dismemberment of the female victim. The FBI profile, suppressed due to preconceived incongruencies between the written profile and the actual defendant, Pacciani, now became strikingly applicable to Antonio. Antonio, as the report predicted, was divorced on the complaint of his wife that he was impotent. Educated and cunning, he had a cruel streak and actually admitted in an interview with journalists that he had possessed a scuba knife, the very knife that is believed to have been used to perform the ritualistic maiming. Upon the interviewer asking Antonio directly if he murdered the couples, his answer was in the negative. He then growled, as he ushered the interviewers out, "I don't play games." Antonio Vinci, who was previously arrested on weapons trafficking charges, now lives free in a suburb of Florence, Italy, and has never been arrested or even formally questioned for being the Monster of Florence. While many citizens of Italy found solace in believing that the now deceased Pacciani was the monster, the facts couldn't be ignored, and many who have examined the case rightfully believe that the monster has never actually been caught.